Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're jumping across a 112-year gap to solve a pretty massive psychological puzzle. What actually gives the things we buy their value? Think about the brands you interact with every single day. Why do you choose them? Why are we all so willing to pay a premium for a specific logo, even when a much cheaper, literally identical alternative is sitting right next to it? We're going to answer those questions by looking at the wild evolution of retail and the deep cognitive psychology that anchors modern brands directly inside our brains. Here is our roadmap for the day. We'll hit the anatomy of brands, building brand equity, and the co-branding phenomenon, before diving into mapping consumer minds, checking out the Yeezy case study, and finally, decoding the brand map. Let's get right into it. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the anatomy of brands. To really grasp modern branding, we've got to look at how wildly products and the identities attached to them have evolved over the last century. Picture this contrast. We're juxtaposing two entirely different eras of retail. First, we have the rugged, survivalist gear from a rare 1906 Abercrombie & Fitch catalog. Back in the day, this company was outfitting prospectors and explorers with hardcore items like tents, camp stoves, and even hypodermic syringes. Today, that exact original catalog is valued at around $850. Now contrast that utilitarian gear with a modern $350 pair of Kanye West's Yeezy sneakers, which perfectly represents the explosion of the modern athleisure market. Look at this stark instruction printed right on page 320 of that 1906 catalog. Please destroy all previous issues. It's just so incredibly utilitarian, right? It perfectly shows how early brands were purely functional. That catalog was literally just a price list for survival tools. The brand itself was nothing more than a guarantee that the product would actually work. But man, over the last century, brands have evolved way beyond basic utility. They've turned into these complex, identity-driven concepts, where the name on the product is often far more important than what the product actually does. Moving to Section 2, building brand equity. That massive gap between a purely functional 1906 camp stove and a highly sought-after modern sneaker brings us to the underlying science of how brands actually generate value today. It's all about brand equity. Basically, brand equity is that magic markup, the incremental value created when a brand name is attached to a product. It's the sole reason you're willing to pay top dollar just because a certain name is stamped on the side. But here is the secret. That value, it doesn't live in a factory, and it definitely doesn't live on a store shelf. It is built entirely inside your head. It's constructed from your thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and past experiences stored in your memory. The stronger those mental associations, the higher the equity, and the more a company can successfully charge you for it. All right, Section 3, the co-branding phenomenon. So if equity is almost entirely psychological, how do companies just artificially generate it? The ultimate shortcut here is co-branding. This is when two or more established brands merge their identities, sharing skills and combining resources to achieve way more financial value together than they ever could separately. We see this a lot. But this brings us to a totally unprecedented partnership, the collaboration between Kanye West, a guy who is decidedly not an athlete, and sportswear giant Adidas to create the Yeezy brand. Traditionally, athletic brands partner with athletes. You know, Nike and Michael Jordan. The product context makes perfect sense. So partnering with a hip-hop artist with zero sports ties, that was a massive, industry-shaking paradigm shift. And it was a shift that paid off in ways nobody saw coming. After leaving Nike for Adidas specifically to gain creative control, West actually dropped a lyric in 2015, boldly bragging that his Yeezy Boost sneakers had culturally and commercially outperformed the legendary Air Jordan brand. At the time, it sounded like your standard celebrity bravado, but the actual underlying financial data told a ridiculously compelling story. Yeah, that was definitely not an empty flex. Because of this collaboration, Adidas watched their share of the $1 billion secondary sneaker market absolutely explode, skyrocketing from a tiny 1% up to a staggering 30%. They even overtook the Jordan brand as the #2 footwear brand in the entire United States. It just demonstrates the staggering financial power of co-branding. When a company taps into the highly engaged personal brand of a cultural influencer, they aren't just selling shoes anymore. They are monetizing influence. Which brings us to Section 4, mapping consumer minds. So how exactly does a rapper create that kind of overwhelming billion-dollar value for an athletic company directly inside the minds of consumers? To figure that out, Researchers at Louisiana State University used a brilliant, standardized approach from cognitive psychology called brand concept mapping, or BCM. It's essentially a way to extract and visualize the complex network of associations living right inside human memory. It's based on this concept called human associative memory theory, which basically suggests that everything you know about a brand is stored as individualized little pieces of information, all wired together in your brain like a giant puzzle. The researchers turned this incredibly dense psychological task into a super easy 3-step recipe. Step 1 is elicitation, which is just gathering the initial keywords consumers blurt out when they hear the brand name. Step 2 is mapping, where consumers literally draw out how those words connect to the brand. And step 3 is aggregation, where researchers mathematically smash all those individual maps together to find the ultimate consensus. Let's look at section 5, the Yeezy case study. Now we'll see how this whole methodology turns into actual tangible data by diving into the LSU Yeezy study. In that first step, they surveyed 158 participants and got this chaotic brain dump of over 1,700 words and phrases. To make any sense of it, experts had to filter that massive list down into a tight core bank of just 62 distinct words. They tossed out all the repetitive stuff, like keeping the word expensive but throwing out pricey or overpriced, just to make sure they had perfectly clean data for the mapping phase. Now, what's genuinely fascinating here is the stark contrast in how different consumers mentally organize the exact same brand. You look at one map drawn by a 21-year-old student, and it's this densely packed, highly engaged mental web with multiple levels branching out everywhere. But then you look at another map drawn by a student of the exact same age, and it is completely bare bones, just a handful of direct, unlinked words floating around. 57 college students sat down and physically drew these maps. They were given a circle with the word Yeezy in the middle, and that bank of 62 words. They drew links connecting the concepts. But here's the kicker. They used single, double, or triple lines to represent exactly how strong they felt those psychological links were. A triple line meant a deeply ingrained mental association, while a single line meant it was pretty weak. And finally, Section 6, decoding the brand map. So now, armed with dozens of these wildly different hand-drawn diagrams, researchers had to mathematically cut through all that subjective noise to find the objective truth. They applied some extremely strict mathematical aggregation rules to do this. They calculated the average number of direct links to the brand, the total number of links on the map, and the average strength based on those single, double, and triple lines. If an isolated word wasn't connected to other associations with enough mathematical frequency, it got completely scrapped. This ensured that only the most deeply interconnected, frequently mentioned concepts survived to form one master consensus map. And here is the big reveal. When all that academic rigor and math is applied, this billion-dollar modern fashion brand boils down to exactly 7 specific concepts anchored directly in the consumer's brain. Kanye, expensive, Adidas, overrated, trendy, sneakers, and athleisure. Look at that wild mix. You've got the parent brands, the product category, but then you have these subjective value judgments, expensive, trendy, and yeah, even overrated. But it's amazing because despite those negative connotations, that psychological web was still powerful enough to drive massive market share and insane secondary market prices. It really is a crazy journey, isn't it? Going from a purely utilitarian 1906 tent catalog advising you to destroy all previous issues, all the way to mapping the complex psychology of a $350 sneaker. It really makes you stop and wonder how your own consumer identity has been carefully engineered by the companies you love. Because brand equity, it's not just a logo on a box. It is literally the architecture of your own memory. So I'll leave you with this. If you had to sit down right now and draw the mental connections in your own brain, what would the concept map of your absolute favorite brand look like? What invisible strings are pulling you toward the checkout line?